To save a man is to inherit a debt that nations will not pay. To forget him is to make the debt eternal. The parachute opened like a fist unclenching in the dark. Captain George Musulin felt the jerk at his shoulders, the sudden deceleration that turned falling into floating, and then the cold, Serbian cold, August cold, the kind that comes off mountains and smells of stone and unfamiliar earth. Below him the landscape was black except where moonlight caught the edge of a field or the spine of a road. No lights. No fires. Just the enormous silence of occupied country, the kind of silence that swallows aircraft engines and parachute silk and 3 American men dropping into a war that wasn't quite their war, not in the way wars are usually counted. He couldn't see Rajasic or Jubilian. The C-47 had banked hard after the jump, engines already fading north toward Italy, toward safety, toward the places where men slept in beds and woke to coffee instead of enemy patrols. Musulin pulled his risers, trying to steer toward what looked like open ground, away from the tree line that could snap a leg or hang a man like laundry for the Germans to find at dawn. His boots hit earth sooner than he expected. He rolled, felt the shock travel up through his knees and spine, and lay still for a moment, breathing, listening. Nothing. Then, distant, a dog barking. Then nothing again. He gathered the chute, hands working fast in the dark, bundling the silk into something he could bury or hide. Standard procedure. Except there was nothing standard about this. 3 men, dropped blind into the mountains of western Serbia, tasked with finding scattered American airmen, bomber crews shot down over Ploesti, over the Romanian oil fields, men who'd bailed out and drifted south into the wrong kind of wilderness. Men hiding in haystacks and root cellars, protected by villagers who spoke no English and risked execution for the charity. Dozens of them, maybe more. The OSS didn't know. Nobody knew. That was the problem. Musulin found a depression in the earth, stuffed the parachute in, kicked dirt over it. Not perfect, but it would do until daylight, until he could orient himself, until he could find the others. He checked his pack, radio parts, medical supplies, a sidearm he hoped he wouldn't need, and a notebook with names, coordinates, frequencies, intelligence so thin it barely counted as intelligence. The briefing in Bari had been optimistic in the way briefings are when nobody wants to admit they're sending you into a situation they don't understand. Make contact with local forces. Assess the situation. Report back. As if Serbia were a neat grid on a map instead of a country being pulled apart by 3 armies and 2 rival resistance movements, 1 communist and 1 royalist, both armed, both suspicious, both willing to kill for the future they imagined. He heard a whistle. Low 2 notes. The signal. Musulin whistled back and started walking toward it, moving carefully, listening for the sound of boots that weren't his own. He found Rajasic first, crouched in a shallow gully, already camouflaged with mud and grass, already scanning the horizon with the instinct of a man who'd grown up hunting in country not far from this. Sergeant Mike Rajasic, son of Serbian immigrants, the only one among them who could speak the language, who knew the cadence of it, the old words his parents had carried to Pennsylvania and kept alive in a kitchen in McKeesport. He looked at Musulin and nodded once. Jubilian? Musulin whispered. 50 yards west. He's fine. Landed in a field. They found Arthur Jubilian sitting against a tree, testing the radio with careful hands, earphones on, listening to static. He looked up when they approached, pulled one earphone off, said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. They were down. They were alive. The rest would come. They buried their chutes together, marked the spot in Musulin's notebook with coordinates they'd probably never see again, and started walking south, toward the villages, toward the rumors of Americans hiding in the hills. The night smelled of hay and smoke, old smoke, the kind that lingers after something has burned for days. Somewhere a bird called, a strange sharp sound Musulin didn't recognize. European bird. European night. He thought of the men they were here to find, pilots and bombardiers and gunners who'd flown missions they'd been told were crucial, who'd watched their B-24s come apart in flak and fire, who'd pulled their ripcords and floated down into this. Some of them had been here for months. Half a year, in some cases. waiting. Hoping the war would turn, that someone would remember them. It took 2 days to find the first one. His name was Lieutenant Robert Wilson, and he was hiding in a barn outside a village called Pranjani, sleeping in straw, eating bread and goat cheese brought to him by a farmer's wife who crossed herself every time she saw him, as if his presence were both a blessing and a curse. Wilson had been shot down in April. For months he'd been moving from house to house, village to village, passed along a network of people who barely knew each other but shared the same stubborn, suicidal decency. When Musulin walked into the barn, Wilson stood up fast, blinking, disbelieving, his face so thin it looked like something carved from wood. "You're American," Wilson said. Not a question. A fact he was testing against reality. "We are," Musulin said. "How many more of you are there?" Wilson laughed, a short, broken sound. "I stopped counting at 30. But it was more than 30. It was 50, then 70, then 100. They came out of the hills like ghosts, words spreading through the villages faster than Musulin could track, American airmen emerging from cellars and attics and forest hideouts, men with beards and lice and the glazed, patient look of people who'd learned to wait. Some of them had been shot down over Belgrade. Some over the Danube. Some had walked 200 miles, guided by shepherds and priests who pointed the way south, toward Pranjani, toward the high plateau where the land opened up and the Germans didn't patrol as often. Toward Mihailović. General Draža Mihailović. The name carried weight, though what kind of weight depended on who was saying it. To the British, he was a former ally, now suspect, possibly collaborating with the enemy, certainly out of favor since Churchill had thrown support behind Tito's communist partisans. To the villagers, he was still the general, still the man who'd refused to surrender when Yugoslavia fell, who'd taken to the mountains with what remained of the Royal Army and waged a slow, grinding resistance against the Germans. To the Americans hiding in his territory, he was the reason they were still alive. Musulin met him on the third night, in a farmhouse with blackout windows and a single candle burning on the table. Mihailović was smaller than Musulin had expected, compact and bearded, his uniform worn but clean, his eyes sharp and tired in the way of men who've made too many decisions with too little information. He spoke through Radjicic, who translated with careful precision, feeling his way through the dialect, the formal registers, the weight of what was being said. "Your men are safe here," Mihailović said. "We protect them. We're grateful," Musulin said. "But we need to get them out. All of them." Mihailović nodded slowly. "You will need an airstrip." "Yes. The Germans patrol these roads. Their planes fly reconnaissance twice a day. You understand what you are asking?" "I do." Mihailović looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, a brief, weary smile. "Then we will build it." The village that held them was called Pranjani, though on German maps it appeared as nothing, or as a dot too small to warrant notation. 50 houses, maybe 60, scattered across hillsides that turned gold in late summer, with wheat and barley stubble catching the light. The houses were stone and timber, thick-walled against winter, with roofs of clay tile that had weathered 100 years and would weather 100 more if the war didn't burn them first. In one of these houses lived Milica Petrović, a widow whose husband had been shot by the Germans in 1941 for hiding a wounded partisan. She was 43 years old and looked 60, her hands gnarled from work, her face lined by grief and sun. She had 2 sons, 16 and 14, both tall and silent, both old enough to be taken for labor or worse if the Germans decided the village needed to be taught a lesson. Milica had been hiding Lieutenant Robert Wilson since May. She fed him from her own rations, gave him her son's bed, taught him to move quietly through the house at night when patrols came near. She did this because when Wilson had appeared at her door, half-starved and speaking a language she didn't understand, she'd seen in his face something she recognized, terror mixed with hope, the look of a man who'd been falling and had finally touched ground. She'd taken him in without discussion, as if the decision had been made long before he arrived, made by something older than politics or allegiance, made by whatever principle insists that strangers deserve shelter and the hungry deserve bread. When Musulin arrived in the village and began cataloguing the airmen, Milica was among the first to come forward. She brought Wilson to the makeshift headquarters in the schoolhouse, walking beside him through streets where neighbors watched from doorways, their faces careful, neutral. She didn't speak to Musulin directly, Draža translated, but her message was clear. This man had been entrusted to her, and she was delivering him whole. She wants to know if he'll be safe, Draža said. Musulin looked at Milica, at the set of her jaw, the way her hands gripped the shawl around her shoulders. Tell her yes. Tell her we'll get him home, Draža translated. Milica nodded once, touched Wilson's arm briefly, and left without another word. Wilson watched her go, his throat working, unable to speak. She saved my life, he said finally. I know, Musulin said. We're going to make sure it counts. But making it count required an airstrip, and an airstrip required a miracle. The plateau above Pranjani was 500 feet of rough meadow, sloped and studded with rocks, the soil thin over bedrock. To land AC-47 there would require leveling, grading, compacting, work that would take weeks with proper equipment, and couldn't be done at all with shovels and carts and human labor. Or so conventional wisdom said. Mihailović stood on the plateau with Musulin on a morning in mid-August and looked at the land as if it were a problem to be solved rather than an impossibility to be mourned. 500 feet, Mihailović said. Is that enough? Barely, Musulin said. The pilots will have to come in low and brake hard. No margin for error. Then we make no errors. The work began that night. Men and women from Pranjani and the surrounding villages came with tools, pickaxes, shovels, wooden sledges for hauling stone. They worked in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, moving earth by hand, prying boulders from the soil, filling depressions with gravel and tamping it down with logs. The children carried water. The old men sorted stones. The women sang quietly, old songs that kept time, that turned labor into rhythm. No lights. No fires. Just moonlight and the sound of metal biting earth, and the creak of cart wheels on the path up from the village. Musulin worked alongside them, his hands blistering, his back aching, learning the names of the men who worked beside him, learning the cadence of the language through repetition and gesture. There was Jovan, a schoolteacher who swung a pickaxe with methodical precision. There was Marco, a farmer who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and compensated with grip strength that bent iron. There was Anna, a girl of 17 who carried rocks in a canvas sling and never complained, never slowed, never asked why they were doing this. They all knew why. The Americans had to go home. The village had promised them safety, and this was the price of keeping that promise. The Germans flew over twice a day, reconnaissance flights that followed the roads and river valleys, looking for partisan camps, supply depots, anything worth bombing. Each time the lookouts on the ridge spotted a plane, the workers scattered, crawling into brush and gullies, lying flat in the tall grass until the engine noise faded. Then they returned to work. The airstrip grew slowly, foot by foot, a scar across the plateau that they disguised each morning with branches and grass, making it invisible from above, or invisible enough. Close enough. Jubilian set up the radio in a cellar beneath the schoolhouse, the antenna strung through a window well, camouflaged with vines. Every night he transmitted to Bari, to the OSS station in Italy, updating them on the count of airmen, the progress on the strip, the position of German patrols. Every night he listened for the reply, for the confirmation that planes were coming, that the extraction was approved, that someone in a clean office far from this war had decided these men were worth the risk. The replies came in terse code, acknowledged. Stand by. Evaluating. They don't believe us, Jubilian said one night, pulling off the headphones, rubbing his eyes. They think we're exaggerating the numbers. How many do we have now? Musulin asked. 94 confirmed. Maybe more coming in from the east. Tell them 94. Tell them the strip will be ready by September 1st. And if they don't send the planes? Musulin didn't answer. There was no good answer. They promised these men rescue, promised the villagers that the risk would be worth it, promised Mihailović that the Americans wouldn't forget. If the planes didn't come, all of it would unravel. The Germans would find the airstrip eventually, or an informant would talk, or Tito's partisans would move into the area and turn the village into a battlefield. Every day they waited was a day closer to catastrophe. But the planes came. The message arrived on August 28th, extraction approved. First flight September 1st 0700 hours. Prepare strip. Expect 4 aircraft initial sortie. Musulin read the message 3 times to be sure he decoded it correctly, then ran to find Musulin. They were on the plateau, doing final grading, smoothing the last rough patches, marking the edges of the strip with white stones. When Musulin told him, Musulin stopped working, leaned on his shovel, and looked at the sky as if he could see the planes already, as if they were already descending through the morning haze. 4 planes, he said. 48 men. If they send more flights, they will. They'll see it works, and they'll send more. Rajicic was standing nearby, listening. We should tell the general. They found Mihailović in his quarters, a small room in a farmhouse at the edge of the village, furnished with a cot, a table, a lamp. He was writing in a ledger, recording something in careful script, his handwriting precise despite the dim light. When Musulin told him about the planes, he set down the pen and folded his hands. September 1st, Mihailović said. 3 days. Yes. The Germans will see them. Probably. Then we will need to be very fast, and very lucky. Yes. Mihailović stood, walked to the window, looked out at the village where smoke rose from chimneys and children played in the street, oblivious or pretending to be oblivious. These people have given everything, he said quietly. If this fails, the Germans will burn the village. You understand that? I do. And you still want to do this? We didn't come here to hide, Musulin said. We came to get them out. Mihailović turned, looked at him with an expression Musulin couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe? Or resignation? Or some combination of the two. Then we will get them out, he said. God willing. The morning of September 1st arrived clear and cold, the sky empty of clouds, the kind of day pilots pray for and ground troops dread. Musulin was on the plateau at 0600, checking the strip one last time, walking the length of it, testing the surface with his boots. 520 feet, more or less level, compacted as well as hand tools could compact it. Not perfect. Not even close to perfect. But enough. It had to be enough. The airmen were assembled in a grove of trees at the edge of the strip, 48 men chosen by lottery from the 94 waiting. They bathed as well as they could in cold water, shaved with dull razors, put on whatever clean clothes the villagers could spare. They looked like refugees pretending to be soldiers, or soldiers pretending to be civilians, or something in between. They stood in small groups, smoking, not talking much, watching the sky. At 0650 Musulin picked up the radio, tuned to the frequency the pilots would be using, and listened. Static. Wind noise. Then, faint, a voice. Halyard ground, this is Halyard flight. 4 aircraft inbound. ETA 10 minutes. Musulin keyed the mic. Halyard flight, this is Halyard ground. Strip is clear. Wind negligible. You are cleared to land. Roger, Halyard ground. We have visual on your position. Musulin heard them before he saw them, the low drone of engines coming from the northwest, growing louder, resolving into 4 distinct sounds. Then they appeared, breaking through the haze, for C-47s in loose formation, flying low, wings wobbling as they adjusted to the terrain. The sight of them was so improbable, so impossible, that for a moment Musulin thought he was hallucinating, that the stress and the sleeplessness had finally broken something in his brain. But they were real. The lead plane was descending, dropping altitude, lining up with the strip. On the ground, the villagers had come out to watch, standing at the edge of the plateau, shielding their eyes against the sun. Milica was there, holding her youngest son's hand, her face unreadable. Mihailović stood apart, arms folded, his expression grim. The tension was unbearable, the silence absolute except for the engines. The first plane touched down hard, bounced, settled, and braked. The pilot reverse thrust, the propellers screaming, the plane shuddering as it decelerated. It stopped with 30 feet to spare. The cargo door opened, and a crew chief jumped out, waving the airmen forward. They ran, not looking back, climbing into the plane in a scramble of boots and elbows. 12 men. 45 seconds. The door closed, the engines revved, and the plane turned, taxiing to the far end of the strip for takeoff. The second plane was already landing. It went like that for 20 minutes. Land, load, takeoff, repeat. The pilots were magnificent, threading the needle between too fast and too slow, trusting the strip, trusting the ground crew, trusting Musulin's promise that this insane plan would work. The fourth plane took off at 0722, engines straining, wheels lifting just before the end of the strip, climbing into the morning light and banking west. Musulin stood in the middle of the plateau, watching them disappear, feeling the adrenaline drain out of him and leave behind something that might have been relief, or might have been terror. 48 men. 0 casualties. The Germans hadn't come. Nothing had broken. It had worked. Draža walked over, put a hand on his shoulder. "They'll send more," he said. "You know they will." "I know." And they did. Over the next 10 days, the planes returned, 4 at a time, sometimes 6, landing in daylight on a strip that shouldn't have existed, evacuating men who shouldn't have survived. The villagers worked between flights, repairing damage to the strip, camouflaging it from the air, preparing for the next sortie. German reconnaissance flew over twice more, but the timing was wrong, the strip empty, the evidence invisible. Or the pilots saw and reported but weren't believed, or the reports were filed and forgotten, or the German command had larger problems and decided a meadow in Serbia wasn't worth investigating. Whatever the reason, the flights continued. By September 10th, they'd evacuated 212 men. By September 20th, 340. The airmen came from all over, from Pranjani, from villages to the east, from caves in the mountains where they'd been hiding for months. They arrived gaunt and grateful, speaking in whispers, unable to believe they were going home. Some of them cried. Some of them just stared at the planes as if they were miracles made of aluminum and gasoline. Milica came to the plateau on the last day of the operation, carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She found Wilson among a group waiting to board, and she gave him the bread without ceremony, as if it were a normal thing, as if she hadn't spent the last 4 months risking her life to keep him alive. Wilson took the bread, held it like something sacred, and tried to thank her. She shook her head, touched his face briefly, and walked away before he could say anything more. Later, Musulin asked Draža what she'd said. Draža had been standing nearby, had overheard the exchange. She said, "Go with God. Don't forget us." The last plane lifted off on September 29th, carrying the final group of airmen and the 3 OSS men who'd made it possible. Musulin sat in the cargo hold, strapped into a jump seat, listening to the engines, feeling the plane climb and bank. Through the small window he could see the plateau falling away, the village shrinking, the mountains receding into haze. He thought of Mihailović, who'd refused to board, who'd stayed behind to face whatever was coming. He thought of Milica and Jovan and Marko and Anna, who'd built an airstrip with their hands and asked for nothing in return. He thought of the debt they'd incurred, the obligation that couldn't be measured in words or medals or official commendations. He thought, "We owe them everything, and we'll pay them nothing." When the plane crossed into Italian airspace, the crew chief came back and told them they could relax, they were safe now. Musulin unbuckled his harness but didn't relax. He couldn't. Safe was a relative term. Safe for him, maybe. Safe for Draža and Jubilian and the 500 men they'd evacuated. But not safe for the people who'd sheltered them. Not safe for Mihailović. Not safe for the village that had risked annihilation to keep a promise. In Washington, Musulin wrote reports. He described the operation in clinical detail, the insertion, the reconnaissance, the construction of the airstrip, the flights. He praised Mihailović and the villagers, documented their contributions, argued for recognition and support. The reports were read and acknowledged. Senior officers expressed satisfaction with the mission's success. 512 men rescued, 0 casualties. Extraordinary. Well done. But Mihailovic's name disappeared from subsequent briefings. The official narrative shifted. The rescue at Pranjani became a story about American ingenuity and courage, about OSS effectiveness and Air Force precision. The Serbs were mentioned in passing, if at all. Background. Local assistance. Footnotes. By 1945, Mihailović was a liability. Tito had consolidated power, the Communists controlled Yugoslavia, and the Allies needed Tito more than they needed the memory of a royalist general who'd been on the wrong side of history. When Mihailović was arrested in March 1946, the State Department issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern for due process. When he was executed in July, the statement expressed regret. The rescued airmen wrote letters, sent telegrams, organized petitions. Their letters were acknowledged and filed. Musulin attended the first reunion in 1948, a gathering of survivors in a hotel in Chicago. 200 men, some with wives and children, telling stories over drinks, laughing and crying and trying to explain to people who hadn't been there what it had been like. They remembered the barn, the bread, the sound of the C-47s. They remembered Milica. They remembered Mihailović. They toasted the villagers, the OSS team, the pilots. They toasted the dead. At the end of the night, Wilson found Musulin at the bar. He was drunk, or nearly drunk, his eyes red, his voice thick. "We didn't save them," he said. "They saved us, and we didn't save them." "I know," Musulin said. "So what do? We remember. We tell the story. We make sure people know. Is that enough?" Musulin didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all they had. The years passed. The reunions continued, smaller each time, the men graying and dying, the stories calcifying into ritual. Musulin retired, moved to Virginia, kept the newspaper clippings and photographs in a box in his closet. He wrote letters to historians, correcting errors, adding details, trying to preserve what he could. Some of the letters were answered. Most weren't. The history moved on. Yugoslavia became a name on a map, then a war, then a set of smaller names. The village of Pranjani appeared in a few books about World War II, usually in a paragraph or a footnote, usually without the names of the people who'd built the airstrip. In 1977, Musulin traveled back. He was 64 years old, carrying a camera and a notebook and the address of a man who'd written to him, a man who claimed to be Milica's son. The Yugoslavia he found was different from the one he remembered: paved roads, concrete buildings, a pervasive grayness that seemed less about poverty than about the weight of ideology. But Pranjani was still there, smaller, quieter, the old houses standing among new ones, the plateau above the village still empty and green. He found the son, Petr, running a small garage at the edge of the village. Petr was 52, thick-set, balding, his hands blackened with grease. He recognized Musulin's name, invited him in, served him coffee. They spoke through a translator Musulin had hired in Belgrade, a young man who translated mechanically, without emotion. "Your mother," Musulin said. "Is she? She died in 1963. Cancer. I'm sorry." Petr shrugged. "It was a long time ago." They drove up to the plateau together, Petr's truck bouncing over ruts, the road barely a road. When they arrived, Musulin got out slowly, looking at the field, trying to match his memory to the landscape. The airstrip was gone, erased by decades of weather and grass, but the contours were still there, the shape of it visible if you knew what to look for. He walked the length of it, counting paces, remembering. Petr followed, not speaking, letting Musulin have the silence. Finally, Musulin stopped, turned to face him. "She saved my friend's life. Your mother. She sheltered him, fed him, risked everything for him. I know. She told me. We evacuated 500 men from here. Your mother and your neighbors made it possible. I know. And we left you. We left all of you. Mihailović was executed, and we didn't stop it. The village got nothing. No recognition. No protection. Nothing. Peter looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A button. A brass button from a U.S. Army Air Forces uniform, worn smooth, the eagle still visible. He pressed it into Musulin's hand. My mother kept this. The American she sheltered gave it to her before he left. She carried it every day until she died. Not because she wanted thanks. Because it reminded her that she'd done something that mattered. Musulin closed his fingers around the button, felt the weight of it, the temperature of the metal warming in his palm. It mattered, he said. It still matters. Then tell people. Tell them what happened here. I have. I've been telling them for 30 years. Then keep telling them. They stood together in the field, two men separated by language and history and the unbridgeable gap between the saved and the saviors. The wind moved through the grass, making a sound like distant engines, and Musulin thought of all the things that couldn't be repaid, all the debts that compounded over time, all the obligations that passed from one generation to the next without ever being settled. He thought about what it meant to owe everything to people you'd never see again, to carry that weight until it became part of you, indistinguishable from memory or conscience or grief. He flew home 2 days later, the button in his pocket. He kept it on his desk after that, next to the photographs and the citations and the letters. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and he'd tell them the story, or part of the story, the version that fit in a conversation. He'd talk about the airstrip and the planes and the 500 men. He'd talk about courage and ingenuity and the remarkable cooperation between Americans and Serbs. He'd mention Mihailović, usually, and the villagers sometimes. But he'd leave out the harder parts, the execution, the abandonment, the way gratitude and betrayal could exist in the same gesture, the same policy, the same breath. He died in 1987, on a Tuesday in March, the button still in his desk drawer. His daughter found it when she was sorting through his things, along with the photographs and the letters and a journal he'd kept sporadically over the years. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. 43 years since Pranjani. Still can't sleep some nights. Still see Milica's face. Still hear Mihailović saying it won't matter. He was right and wrong. It mattered to the men we saved. It didn't matter to history. Which one counts more? I don't know. I'll never know. The daughter's name was Catherine. She was 52, a librarian in Baltimore, and she'd grown up with fragments of the story, her father's occasional mentions of Serbia, of the war, of men he'd saved and people he couldn't save. She'd never understood the weight of it, not really, until she found the journal and read it cover to cover in one sitting, crying by the end, not because the story was sad but because she finally understood what her father had been carrying all those years. She donated the button to a museum along with his papers and photographs, but before she did, she made copies of everything. She scanned the journal, the photographs, the letters from airmen and historians and strangers who'd written to thank her father or ask for clarification or challenge his version of events. She put it all on a website, a simple thing with a plain design and no advertisements, just the documents and a brief explanation. This is the story my father spent his life trying to tell. The website got modest traffic at first. Veterans found it, their children found it, history students writing papers found it. Then, in 1999, during the Kosovo War, a journalist stumbled across it while researching Balkan history. She wrote an article about Operation Halyard, about the rescue at Pranjani, about Mihailović and Milica and the 500 men who'd been saved by people history had forgotten. The article was picked up by wire services, translated into Serbian, shared across the internet that was just then becoming a place where old stories could find new audiences. Petar Petrović, Milica's son, was 74 years old when he saw the article. He was living in the same house where his mother had hidden Lieutenant Wilson, the house that had survived the war and the communist years and the breakup of Yugoslavia. He had grandchildren now, and great-grandchildren, and he told them the story the way his mother had told it to him, plainly, without embellishment, as a fact of their family history. Your great-grandmother saved an American pilot during the war. She fed him from our table. She risked all our lives to keep him alive. This is what we do. We help people who need help. When Petr saw Catherine's website, he found an email address, wrote a message in broken English, and sent it before he could second-guess himself. Catherine received it 3 days later. I am son of Milica Petrović. Your father came to Pranjani in 1977. He was good man. My mother spoke of him. Thank you for remembering. They began to correspond. Short emails at first, tentative, feeling their way across the gap of language and culture and history. Catherine's Serbian was non-existent. Petr's English was rudimentary. They relied on translation software and patience. But gradually, over months and years, a picture emerged. 2 families connected by a war either of them had fought, bound by a debt neither of them had incurred but both of them inherited. In 2004, 60 years after Operation Halyard, Catherine traveled to Serbia. Petr met her at the airport in Belgrade, a thin old man with gentle eyes and her father's button, the twin of the one in the museum, pinned to his jacket. They drove to Pranjani together, the roads better now but still winding, still climbing through mountains that looked the same as they had in 1944. The village had changed, new houses, satellite dishes, a small market. But the plateau was still there, and the field where the airstrip had been. They walked it together, Catherine and Petr, along with Petr's grandson, a boy of 16 who carried a video camera and recorded everything with the solemnity of someone who understood he was documenting something important. Catherine had brought flowers, white roses, and she placed them at the spot where Petr said the first plane had landed. They stood in silence for a while, 3 generations removed from the events but still tethered to them, still carrying the weight. Your father, Petr said, his English slow and careful. He came here to remember. You come here to remember. This is good. This is how we keep them alive. I wish he could have come back again, Catherine said. I wish he could have seen this. He saw it. He saw it every day. In his mind he never left. That night, in Petr's house, Catherine met the villagers, the children and grandchildren of the people who'd built the airstrip, who'd sheltered the airmen, who'd risked everything. They brought food, homemade brandy, photographs of their own, images of Americans in leather jackets standing beside old men and women in peasant clothes, images that had been hidden during the communist years and brought out now, carefully, as if they were sacred relics. Everyone had a story. A grandfather who'd carried stones at night. A grandmother who'd baked bread in secret. A great-uncle who'd been a lookout on the ridge, watching for German planes. They asked Catherine about her father. What had he been like? Had he been happy? Had he talked about them? She told them what she could, showed them photographs of him in his later years, read passages from his journal. When she read the entry about not being able to sleep, about still seeing Milica's face, an old woman in the corner began to cry. Her name was Giovanna, and she was Milica's niece, the daughter of Milica's brother. She'd been 7 years old in 1944, had watched the planes land, had seen her aunt give bread to the Americans. She never forgot them, Giovanna said through Petr's translation. Until the day she died, she would say, I wonder if they remember us. I wonder if they're alive. She would have been so happy to know he remembered. So happy. Catherine stayed in Pranjani for a week. She interviewed the villagers, recorded their stories, took hundreds of photographs. When she returned to Baltimore, she expanded the website, added the new material, created an archive. She gave talks at libraries and historical societies, wrote articles for military history journals, contacted the Air Force Museum and pushed for a permanent exhibit on Operation Halyard. Some of her efforts succeeded. Some didn't. But the story spread, slowly, accumulating weight, finding people who needed to hear it. The button sits in a museum now, behind glass, labeled with a small plaque. Button from Operation Halyard, 1944. Donated by Captain George Musulin OSS. But it's not alone anymore. Next to it are photographs, Musulin and Draža and Jubilian in Serbia. Mihailović with American airmen. Villagers standing by the airstrip. Milica Petrović holding a loaf of bread. The plaque is longer now, more detailed, telling the fuller story, naming the names. Visitors pause, read, move on. Some of them are veterans, or children of veterans, or grandchildren. Some of them are Serbian, or Croatian, or just curious. They see the eagle on the button, bright under the museum lights, and they see the photographs, and some of them, not all, but some, begin to understand the complexity of it, the way rescue and abandonment can coexist, the way debts can be inherited and passed down and never quite settled. In Pranjani, there's a memorial now, a simple stone monument at the edge of the plateau with the names of the villages who helped build the airstrip. It was erected in 2007, funded by donations from American veterans' families and Serbian expatriates, and a handful of people who'd read Catherine's website and felt compelled to contribute. The inscription is in Serbian and English. In memory of those who risked everything to save strangers. May we remember their courage. May we honor their sacrifice. Every year on September 1st, people gather there. Not many, a dozen, sometimes 20, but enough. Veterans, when there were still veterans. Their children and grandchildren after the veterans were gone. Villagers, their numbers dwindling. Tourists who've heard the story and made the pilgrimage. They stand together in the field where impossible things once happened, where 512 men were given their lives back, and they tried to hold all of it at once. The gratitude and the guilt, the triumph and the betrayal, the way history forgets and the way individuals remember. Catherine attends when she can. She's 79 now, still sharp, still carrying the story. She brings her own grandchildren, teaches them the names, Musulin, Draža Mihailović, Mihailović, Milica. She tells them about the airstrip and the planes and the people who built something impossible with their hands. She tells them about debts that can't be repaid and obligations that don't expire. She tells them that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that almost get forgotten, and that remembering is a kind of justice, imperfect but necessary. The last time she visited, in 2019, she met a young Serbian filmmaker who was making a documentary about Operation Halyard. He'd found her website years earlier, had been inspired by it, had spent 5 years researching and interviewing and piecing together footage. He showed her a rough cut on his laptop, there in the field, the two of them sitting on folding chairs while the wind moved through the grass. The film was good, honest, complex, unflinching about the political betrayals and clear-eyed about the human courage. It didn't simplify. It didn't make heroes into saints or villains into monsters. It just told the story. "This is what your father wanted," the filmmaker said when it was over. "Isn't it?" Catherine thought about that. Thought about her father sitting in his study in Virginia, writing in his journal, carrying the weight of memory. Thought about what he'd wanted, recognition, yes, but more than that. Truth. Complexity. A record that wouldn't let the world forget the people who'd been forgotten. "Yes," she said. "This is what he wanted." The debt remains. Unpaid in any conventional sense, unmeasured, impossible to quantify. But it's not forgotten anymore, not entirely. It exists in the museum case, in the memorial, in the website, in the documentary, in the stories passed down through families on both sides of the Atlantic. It exists in the annual gathering at Pranjani, in the moment when strangers stand together and try to understand what was owed and what was given, and what it means to remember. Remember Pranjani. Remember Mihailović. Remember Milica. Remember the boy who ran 3 miles and the woman who baked bread and the man who swung a pickaxe in the dark. Remember that 512 men flew home because strangers decided their lives were worth the risk. Remember that gratitude is not enough, that memory is not enough, but that without them there is nothing at all. Remember that some debts live forever, passed from one generation to the next, not as burden but as obligation, not as guilt but as witness. Remember that the button behind the glass was once sewn to a uniform, worn by a man who fell from the sky, torn free and given to a woman who risked everything, carried by her until she died, passed to her son, sent across the ocean to the daughter of the man who'd made the promise. Remember that the story doesn't end. It just finds new people to carry it. Historical note. Operation Halyard occurred between August and December 1944 in Nazi-occupied Serbia. Captain George Musulin, Sergeant Michael Radjusic, and radio operator Arthur Jabilian were inserted by the OSS to coordinate the rescue of downed Allied airmen. General Draža Mihailović and his Chenik forces, along with Serbian villagers, provided protection and labor to construct a crude airstrip near Pranjani. Between 432 and 512 airmen, estimates vary, were evacuated without casualties during the operation, one of the largest rescues of American military personnel in history. Mihailovic's treatment by Allied command remains controversial. Initially supported by Britain, he was abandoned in favor of Tito's communist partisans for strategic reasons in 1943–44. After the war, Tito's government tried Mihailović for collaboration and executed him in July 1946, despite testimony from rescued American airmen. In 1948, President Truman posthumously awarded Mihailović the Legion of Merit, though the award remained classified until 1967 due to political sensitivities. This narrative dramatizes documented events while creating composite characters among the villagers and airmen. Dialogue is invented. The 1977 return visit is fictional, though Musulin did remain an advocate for recognition of those who sheltered airmen. Characters like Milica Petrović represent the many Serbian families who risked execution to shelter Allied airmen. Primary sources include OSS mission reports, Musulin's later testimony, Air Force historical records, and accounts by rescued airmen. The moral questions raised here, about debts between nations and individuals, about the gap between political expedience and personal courage, remain unresolved.